Hi, I'm Katie Crane, and this is the Pilates Lounge. Hello, my friends. This is Katie Crane from the Pilates Lounge. Today, I'm super excited. I've invited a new friend to be interviewed on the podcast. I specifically invited this person because I found her on a hub that I often go to for information, inspiration, and workshops called the Fascia Hub. Now, if you haven't heard about the Fascia Hub, there's links in the show notes, so definitely jump down and check out the links. If you love movement, then I can guarantee you're going to be absolutely blown away by the information within the hub. Today, I've got with me Lisa Babuik from Soul Fitness Mind Body Studios, all the way over in the northwestern Canada, St. Albert. I'm pretty sure you said, Lisa. So welcome to the show, Lisa. Thank you so much for joining me. I would love for you to introduce yourself and let us know a little bit about yourself. And once you have let us know a little bit about yourself, what it is that you do, I've got one super important question for you, but I'm going to give the microphone over to you first, just so that you can introduce yourself to our listeners.
Okay, thank you, Katie, and thank you for having me. So I am in St. Albert in Alberta, Canada, and I own a yoga studio that has sort of expanded into different realm of movement that we call integral movement systems. And I've been teaching in the fitness and wellness industry for 33 years now, and kind of across the board, with the exception of Katie Pilates. I haven't taught Pilates. So over that amount of time, I've had many different experiences that have brought me to here, and working from a yoga practice as well as integral movement, that we teach people, really educate people about their movement, which is a whole different way than I'm used to doing. We sort of switched over probably 7 or 8 years ago from a prescribed protocol kind of approach. So if you had a bad back, then we did ABCD, and that should address the issues of back pain. Whereas now it's a whole different perspective of noticing how people move, and in that movement, where is the disconnect? Where is the loss of force transmission in the movement? So it's been an amazing experience that here we are. And yes, I'm excited to share about my experience and things with you.
Awesome. Now, you use the word movement, so this is leading into my next question. What does movement mean to you? Like personally, professionally, if you want to touch on spiritually, when you think of movement, what does it mean? What does it invoke?
Lots. To me, movement is life. Movement is how we live. It's how we animate ourselves in the greater cosmos of the world and the places that we find ourselves to be. And I certainly don't have all the answers, and there's so much more that we are going to learn, and so many things that we don't know we need to learn. I think about, you mentioned the spirit, and I think about what initiates movement in our bodies. And people will say, well, the brain initiates movement and the muscles initiate movement. But as you know, from your experience in dissection in the dissection lab, all those structures are still there. So why does the body not move? And to me, it's the spirit or the soul or whatever that is to you that inspires us to move. And are we inspired to move in a way that's aligned with our nature or not? And that kind of, for me, is movement, and why I say movement is life.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, I'm with you. And so just to let our listeners know, Lisa and I had a chat before we started recording, and we've both had the honor and the pleasure of attending a human dissection workshop with anatomist John Sharkey. So John, I attended it in Dundee in Scotland. You attended it in Ohio, was it?
Yep. Ohio.
Yeah. And so with this dissection workshop, part of the beauty of it is the bodies that are donated, they're kept in, I guess, in a brine solution rather than formaldehyde. So when we get to work with them, the body is still extremely pliable. It's not in kind of this frozen state that formaldehyde lends itself to. And so we're able to see better how the body encompasses itself as a whole. In fact, the muscles and the tendons and the ligaments and even the bones are not completely separate. They're actually everything together. And it really, we were saying to each other that it really changes the way that we look at the body. It changes the way that we perceive the body in movement. But partly what I loved about this course was the spiritual aspect of it. Did you find that, that when we started the weekend together, we all got together and said a prayer for these beautiful people that had donated themselves to the work that we were doing. But there was really a moment of, you could feel the spiritual connection that we had together as a room, but also that we had together with these bodies that were donated. Did you feel that in that experience?
Yeah, I felt for sure the connection of the group coming together for the exploration of through learning, and that the gifts of the donors, there was gratitude there, but their spirit was not. I mean, Joanne Avison states that very clearly, that Descartes, I'm pretty sure it was Descartes, made an agreement with the Pope at the time and said, we get the bodies for dissection and you get the spirit for that whole part of it. And so it was just this profound sense of exploration as a group and realizing the gravity of that, in that the gift that we were given, because you can go to more than one dissection and it will never be the same experience, because what emerges from dissections over however many days you're there is going to be different every time. Each donor is a masterpiece and it's lived a life. And so just the gravity of that is beyond gratitude, and it's profound.
Yeah, you said it much better than me, is that there was recognition of the spiritual experience and recognition of that profound experience. It wasn't just, this is a medical, experience. It wasn't just, this is the body, let's cut it up. There was so much care taken for the entire workshop. There was so much respect within the room for the process that was happening. And for me, that is what embodied the spiritual nature of what we were doing as well. Of course, the soul is no longer with that body, of course. And I love also that there was recognition of that. But it was so much more than just, being in high school, dissecting a frog and not recognizing that this was once a being.
That's right. That's right. And I think that we are fortunate in that it's self-directed. We go in there and here's a scalpel and here's your hemostat and there's your group and go. So whereas in Ohio, we were across the hall from the med students at the university. And so, they were coming to see what we were doing because theirs was very directed. There was a specific task that is necessary to become a medical doctor that made them curious to come into our room and see what we were doing. And wow, we could kind of do what we wanted and move the cadaver around to see what was happening to the fascial tissue and all things that we label in an anatomy book, to see it actually moving and what that actually looks like. We had a medical examiner, I believe she was from California and well known, that was in the dissection lab. And you'd think, well, why would a medical examiner need to be in this dissection? And it's because of the self-directed experience that provides a whole different learning experience for whoever needs that, whether you're a movement professional or a manual therapist or doctor, medical examiner, whatever the case may be. So fantastic.
Yeah, it was pretty special. So for our listeners, definitely, this is also in the show notes. If you ever have an opportunity to be involved in any of John Sharkey's dissection labs, I believe that he is in different places in the world. Gil Headley also does something similar. I think he's mostly based in the US and Canada. And of course, many people would know Tom Myers also works with dissection specifically for movement educators and manual therapists, and it really does lend itself to looking at the body from a very different perspective, because you do get to look at the body as a whole And so, with that in mind, Lisa, having experienced this workshop, I suppose, and then having been involved with the Fascia Hub, because I actually saw you on the Hub because you taught a class for them, didn't you?
I did recently. I did a discussion about stretching, and then prior to that, I did a couple of movement pieces for the Fascia Hub.
Right. And so, with all of that in mind, having had this experience, how has this changed the way that you work with the body, the way that you perceive the body in movement, and what is your understanding of fascia from a movement educator's perspective and as a student, of course?
Okay, so I noticed right at the beginning of the dissection with I was the first one was with Tom Myers. It might have like even been the first day, maybe the second. I can't really remember, but just stopping and looking and going, this doesn't stretch. We need to stop stretching. So pretty much after that, I came back and told all my teachers, we've got to stop stretching. And they looked at me like I was crazy. And what else were we going to do? Because essentially that's what yoga is. And so it was exploring that and feeling it in movement. And if we were feeling stiffness, then what is needed to reduce the stiffness? And that was when fascial release, fascial rolling started to become a thing with the foam rollers and then, different sorts of balls and things like that. So we started to bring that into class and just really listen to what students had to say about it. What was their experience? What were they feeling? What was the before and after inside, not the before and after picture of, this is me before class and this is me after class, even though you can see that, but there's more guidance on the inside. So that was the first thing that, we started to change was how we were excessively stretching. And so it's important, I think, to be clear about what I'm saying when I say stretching, because I do have a class called Integral Stretch, where I'm trying to re-educate people on how human tissue stretches. So the traditional way was to elongate something. Somebody would say, well, my hamstrings are too short, so I can't bend over and touch my toes, and so I need to elongate my hamstrings. And they don't elongate any more than what you grew way back when you were creating yourself. So it's learning what the tissue is. I think it's hard to do that when you haven't seen it, touched it, moved it in a dissection lab. But of course, not everybody's interested in doing that. And so, but there's enough information now that we have that you don't have to extrapolate that from only that experience. There's enough, people doing research and writing papers and bringing it into manual and movement therapy that we can learn.
All right, mic drop. I hear what you're saying, and then we speak the same language. So when you say we can't stretch, I'm like, yeah, totally. But let's dive a little bit deeper into that. What does that mean we can't stretch? Because everybody comes into the studio saying, I'm so tight, I need to stretch my hamstrings. Or we send people home traditionally with a TheraBand, go stretch your hamstrings. What does it mean that we can't stretch muscle?
Sure. So tissue is auxetic in nature. It expands and it recoils. As a fascial network, a web, when you move one thing, globally, everything moves. So when this is one thing that John Sharkey did. I saw him at a conference in Vancouver. I didn't know who he was. And he said, okay, sit on the floor, fold forward, touch your toes. Okay, now put your hands under your hamstrings or on your hamstrings and do the same thing, but feel what's happening in your hands. And I use that example, that experience a lot because it gives people a different perspective of what's really happening. Because if you sit down and you put your hands underneath your legs and you're feeling your hamstrings in your hands, you'll notice that they do not get longer. And so I let them have their experience and they can share, what do you feel? Well, I feel my hamstrings going into my hands. I feel them becoming stiffer. So it's this global network of moving that things are moving in response to force transmission of tension compression. If we stretch too much, that's too much tension. And eventually that can deform the tissue. So I'll use the example, if you're walking and you slip on something slippery, here it would be ice, which happens a lot, and you accidentally do the split. And you go, oh, that was terrible. And you might have consequences from that where you're sore for a couple days. You might tear something, you might, whatever, sprain an ankle, whatever the case. But then we go to yoga, and what do? We try to do the split. So, what is actually happening inside? Nothing does anything independent of everything else. No structure does anything independently of everything else. So when you say stretching muscles, well, there's all kinds of tissue that we have to consider when you talk about stretching muscles. You can't stretch muscles without thinking of nerves or without thinking of blood vessels. The ligaments and tendons also have to be considered. So more dense tissue compared to less dense tissue, and the forces that we're applying to that. So, you can get a gymnast in the splits and then somebody literally pushing them down. So now you're adding force to that. Eventually, the tissue can no longer sustain that, and there's damage. And so when we look at the quick fall where you pull something, you sprain something, that's what we're doing, but over a sustained period of time. So why do we want to do that? What I've learned is that it's the feeling of stretch people are looking for. So people will come here and they'll say, well, I feel really stiff. I feel less mobility in my body. I don't move so well. I have bad balance, whatever the case is. And then we'll take them through an integral stretch, which we're not pulling on the tissues. We're not trying to get range of motion or increase our flexibility. And at the end, they'll say, oh, that was such a good stretch. It's the feeling of stretch. It's the feeling of having more space to move more freely than before. And that is more sustainable.
So is it safe to say you use a roller or a ball, you're laying on that? So is it safe to say that rather than stretch a muscle, we're changing the shape of a muscle, or we're changing the integrity of a muscle by using those tools rather than stretching it?
Yes, you're using those tools to bring space into tissue that has more stiffness than you'd like for movement, for mobility. And not just mobility, but support in mobility, the structural integrity of mobility, that we can still adapt and move really, really well. Because sometimes you see somebody with hypermobility issues like Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and they might have this great range of motion, but it's not supportive. They too have pain, and some of it interrupts day-to-day activities. And that is, I think, the concern of what we're doing when we stretch, that we don't realize that we are creating deformation in the tissue when we want to make the structure provided with more integrity, which for me means, I use the word space and strength. So we want space, not literal space, but this feeling that we can move with ease, but it's supported, if that makes sense.
I think it definitely, for a lot of people, it lends itself to exploring differently and perceiving what we are doing differently. I know for me, when I started exploring these ideas of fascia, I remember the conversation, rather than seeing the body in levers, which was what I had learned when I first started learning movement. For example, the femur is a lever, and you move that lever, rather than looking at it like that. It's seeing the entire body. I think of it as an orchestra, as a symphony working together, and this constant emergence from everything. You can't just look at the body as one part, because once we started to pull apart the layers of the body in that dissection experience, there's no end to it. I had learnt the muscles as individual muscles, which was a great way to start to have a foundation, I suppose. But once you started trying to peel the layers apart, it was really difficult to even figure out where one thing started and the other thing ended. So how could we, in movement, try to be separating those things anyway?
Yes, and they don't separate and they don't move independently of each other. And I noticed it's just what we're paying attention to. And so in class, I will bring awareness to, even though you might be doing, let's say, in a cat-cow type of thing where you're extending and flexing the spine, do we notice that the shoulders are internally and externally rotating as well? And so if we so one common thing is to stack, the stacking. And so when we stack, people say, well, it works. Well, yeah, it works. It works. But how is it not working? So my experience is that when we stack things, let's say we're in tabletop or a plank position, and you've stacked your elbows over your wrists and shoulders over your elbows, that there's not enough room for the spine to extend to its fullest expression. So why I say fullest expression is because I'm not trying to create this expectation that it has to turn out a certain way. That where you feel that your spine has extended in its fullest expression, you can feel it, then that's where people stop and then move into another direction of movement or whatever the case. And so when you're not stacked, you can feel the external rotation of the shoulders that allows the spine to extend in its fullest expression. So we can notice the spine or the shoulders. And then that's where I think people get this well, I'm isolating my spine. Well, no, there's lots going on. Everything's moving. And so then we get a sense of this global perspective of movement rather than this isolation of parts. So I'm going to work my biceps. Okay, but you're also doing pretty much everything else as well. So it takes time to shift and change that, because how long have we been doing it the biomechanical way? A long time. So it's a shift.
Yeah, and it's almost that isolating body parts is a simplified version of what is actually going on. So, maybe it's a starting point for somebody, but once you can move on from that, then I feel like my body moves better now, rather than asking myself, what am I meant to be feeling? It's feeling what I'm feeling, exploring that, and going, seeing where it takes me kind of attitude, which I guess is being more vulnerable in movement as well for some people.
Oh, for sure. For sure. You ask somebody, okay, so how do you feel? And they look at you like, what do you mean how I feel? I'm waiting for you to tell me how I feel, because that's what we've always done. you know, feel the burn, no pain, no gain. And so what were we looking for? John Sharkey often says, just because something feels good doesn't mean it's good for you. So people would say, for example, stretching, they would say, oh, it feels so good. Okay, does it feel good? Or is it because we were told it was good for us that's what we perceive we feel? Oh, that pain, no gain is good. Oh, that's a good feeling because it's obvious. It's right there. I must be doing something really good because I really feel this. Okay, but then what do you really feel the next day and the next day after? So I think about, if exercise and fitness is supposed to be so healthy for us, why are so many people injured? And why are so many people experiencing restrictions in everyday activities that they'd like to do, but because of this chronic pain or these injuries, that they're limited in what they can do? And then people say, well, it's aging. Well, no, it's not aging. You can't tell somebody that's 50 or 60 or younger. I've had younger people come to me and say, well, it's because I'm getting older. A woman in her late 40s said that to me. And I said, okay, so if you live until you're 90, are you willing to go through that length of time in the pain that you're in? That's a long time to be in pain. That's a long time to be restricted. So to me, now that I don't experience pain, I don't get up with pain, I don't go to bed with pain, it's non-negotiable for me. Doesn't mean I'm never going to experience pain, because I'll do something like slip on the ice. Or last week I was helping somebody lift a reclining couch that was really, really heavy, and I ended up being on the bottom going upstairs with this heavy, heavy couch. And I thought, oh, I'm going to be feeling this tomorrow. And there was no ill effect. So it's the longevity that we get out of the exercise that we're doing that I focus on. What is supportive to me? What gives me the longevity? What gives me the ability to do what I enjoy doing? What gives me the ability to push the envelope a little bit?
Yeah. Yeah. Does teaching something like what you understand as good form important at any point in what you're teaching? Or is it exploratory from the get-go? Because I definitely find that I need some, even though I'm looking at the body as much more than just levers and isolating muscles and all of that stuff. When somebody walks into the studio, I'm looking at their facial expression, I'm feeling their energy, the conversation that they have, all of those things to then figure out where it is that we're going to go with the session. But I'm not necessarily having that conversation with them. Like, in fact, what I'm telling them is really quite basic. So for me, the way that I teach, I do start off just with some really basic, this is, this looks good or this is good form before I start to get too exploratory with them. Is that still the way that you teach, or do you explore from the get-go?
I'm not sure. So let me share with you what I do. So I'm like you, that I welcome students in, and then I'm noticing kind of, do they look tired? Those kinds of things that we would normally notice when we're engaging with people. And then when we start, everybody's on their mat, and I tell everybody, get in a comfortable position and then relax and notice your body on the mat, and maybe notice your breath, and then notice how you feel. And now notice what you need. And there's space in between. Like, that's where I think sometimes, well, in fitness, the old way I used to do it, there was no space in between for people to reflect at all. We were telling, and then no reflection. And then at the end, how do you feel? And woohoo, good. It's like, yeah, because I told you for an hour this was good for you. So now I don't tell anybody what they feel. I ask them. And then we start with a center point. So find your center. And a center isn't a specific location in the body, it's an experience. It's where you are centered, where space and strength create structural integrity. The mind is aware of the sensory experience that the body is having. There's a dialogue there, and then people know what they need. And now in the integral classes, people ask for what they need, and they ask questions.
Right. So you've created a culture of self-reflection because of the space that you allow within the way that you teach, rather than dominating the class by just telling people what to do the entire time.
Right. Right. And I've said to them, I want you to know what you need so that you don't need me anymore. Is essentially, what I'm trying to do. When you can find your center, a lot of things happen from that. You might be tired, or you might be about to engage in a situation that is uncomfortable, or you've had an uncomfortable situation, or you're disappointed, or whatever, or you're injured. So finding center is you whole and complete in your integrity in that moment, because it's going to change.
Yeah, and I think that the yoga definitely lends itself to allowing for that space. It tends to be a slower practice. People come in with an understanding that they're going to do some sort of meditative kind of work. I know as a Pilates practitioner, it's taken me years to allow for that same space in the way that I teach, because the way that we're taught to teach, I think the old way that we're taught to teach, I like to think that this is also expanding, because whether or not Joseph Pilates also practiced yoga, and as Pilates became westernized, I feel like it lost the spiritual aspect, it lost the self-awareness aspect, and it became quite dogmatic in the way that it was approached, and I'd like to think that all movement educators are moving back to an area of self-reflection, self-learning, creating space in the class, and and asking the client what it is that they need, rather than telling the client what they need. I definitely feel like yoga naturally allows for that. because of the way that it's practiced. But could you explain what yoga is and what are the benefits and how is it different from other movement practices? Because I know that you didn't initially come from yoga, you initially came from more of a fitness background. What is it that moves you towards yoga in particular?
So I was teaching fitness and feeling like there was nowhere else to go. It was becoming very repetitive. I wasn't fulfilled, and I was considering, leaving and trying something different. And so a friend of mine said, come to Body Balance. I'm like, what's Body Balance? And it's a Les Mills product. It's a lot of fun that combines yoga, Pilates, Feldenkrais, and Qigong. And it's all pre-choreographed. So it was, weekend or two certification, and then, off you go and teach. And so that sort of renewed my spirit, and back into it I went and did it for, I don't know how long it was, but I realized that all of them required much more education and experience. And so I chose the yoga route. And the foundation of yoga is the yamas and niyamas, which are the ethical observances for yourself, not ethical as in, what people are doing to me, but how I am engaging as a spiritual person, aware of myself and then those around me. So it's all about self-realization. That's the goal of yoga, self-realization. And in my first training, we did very little about on the philosophy of yoga. It was very much an intellectual process of reading it and understanding it and being able to recite, and very little in the way of experiencing it. And then when I did my advanced training, we were in it all the time, and it was a vast difference. So I think that yoga too has become kind of the same thing, Katie, that you said about Pilates. It became this sort of it's a very esoteric practice in some ways, and it's become intellectualized rather than a spiritual experience. So it takes away from that. But I think that we're coming back around to, okay, hang on a minute, what are we learning? How is this evolving? And then it's more supportive. Then it is a mind, body, spirit practice. None of those three things are separate from the whole as a human being. And, they're always present in movement. In one way or another, you feel something, you think something, you move, you feel something, you think. There's always this dynamic of these systems continuing to create you in that moment. And so when we intellectualize the process, we're back to the outer stuff, right? It's the instead of practicing something like meditation, it's meditation because it's on the to-do list. And sitting there trying to wait for some profound moment to occur, there's an engagement in it that is an interoceptive experience where we're learning and we're getting insight for what is next. We're coming out of the outer world and giving ourselves some time in our own inner world to really get a sense of really how we tick, so to speak. So you can't take that away. You can make it an intellectual process. You can put protocols on things that, everybody do this, everybody do that, and then this is going to be the result. And it's not, because we're not all the same. We never move the same way twice, in my opinion. So even if you're doing a squat, somebody might say, well, no, if you do 10 reps of squats, you're doing 10 squats. Yeah, but the first squat sets up the possibility for the second squat. The possibility of what? Well, whatever it is that you're looking for in the intention of doing a squat. And that can be various things. Same thing in yoga. Well, why do I want to do the splits? What are the intentions of that? And so then, I think about that and I go, well, I don't want to do them because there's possibility of deformation. It's excessive flexion and extension of the hip. So I'm not interested. However, if I was, a gymnast or a dancer or something like that, well, there's an option.
So when you teach yoga, we've already touched on it a little bit about that muscles don't stretch, they change shape or change form. Has the way that you are teaching changed in that? Are you using more props like the balls and the rollers, or are you still approaching yoga movement in the way that you learnt it?
Well, the way that I originally learned it was very linear. Line your heels in warriors, stack your joints, ground into the floor, in Tadasana, in mountain pose, those kinds of things. So I've moved away from that. We don't line things up. For example, in a warrior two, I just say step back. And then, when you bend and extend the knee and play with the movement a little bit, you can feel the back hip rotating. So when we align things, when we line, heels and such, that dampens that rotation in that back hip, for example. So as we explore that, people find their space, and then oh, well, now when I bring my arms out, I don't feel that my back shoulder is crunched into my ear, because now the force transmission from that movement, that hip is rotating nicely, comes up through the spine and vice versa. And so it changes the practice. And so nobody is left feeling that they can't do it, because there's so many people that say, oh, I can't do yoga. I can't do yoga. And there's many reasons for that. But, explore it. I teach warrior two laying down. You don't want to stand, lay down. It's a whole different experience, because we've got gravity influencing us differently, and ground force is completely different. So the intrinsic experience is going to also be different.
And so when you do I forget the name of your course that you do, your integral movements,
Integral.
right? Integral
Mm-hmm.
movement system. Is that yoga practice merging into a whole lot of other stuff that you've learned with fascia and biotensegrity in mind?
Yes. Yes. So integral movement is, so we have three parts to it. There's integral stretch, integral strength, and integral mind. And so when we're more focusing on the space we're creating, and releasing the tissues, and bringing the integrity back through, sometimes we do a little bit of rolling. We just use balls. We don't use foam rollers, and because they just work better with the roundness of them. Um, and then we might do a little bit of release, and then we will engage in the tension elements that we're not moving beyond we call it the yield in the movement. So you go into one direction, and then the body slows or stops. And traditionally in yoga, what we would do, for example, is we would push beyond that to increase range. So instead of trying to push beyond that, we expand into that. So we just take a pause in there. We might, use the breath to bring awareness to the expansion of and the movement inside. And then the body will move in another direction, because movement is omnidirectional. So we're not forcing beyond that yielding moment. And then in strength, we're creating the structure. So we're adding compression, more of a compression element to the movement, that that we create more structure, more. It's more of a strengthening experience. And then you go, well, both are happening at the same time. Yes, it's just what we're focusing on, really. And then mind, we're just noticing the movements of thought and putting that into perspective. So yes, there's some yoga poses, and sometimes we do squats, and sometimes we do deadlifts, and sometimes we use weight, and sometimes we don't. And the weight that we use is very, very light. And I've had quite a few athletes say, how is this heavy? How is this so much harder than when we go in the weight room and we lift heavier weight? And it's because I am engaging you in a different way than you're used to. And we're taking you out of the linear biomechanics and letting your body move in its nature, and then noticing where the loss of force transmission is, and then bringing either tension or compression into that to create the structural integrity that I see is lost. I'm always looking at where I need to go next in my students or in my clients, because they can see where the movement isn't supportive or supported in their body, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. And do you find that it works well for people who are injured or are in pain? And if so, like, how does it change the way maybe that they listen to their body, or that they work with their own body?
So when we started doing integral movement, I had a teacher here and I'm sharing because she had given me permission to share her experience. She had an injury. She had a compression in her lumbar spine that was compressing on the nerve, and she was experiencing extreme pain. And she came to me and she said, "Can you try that new stuff on me?" And I looked at her and I was like, I don't know, because, I didn't know how far she was from, maybe not walking or something. And so I said, okay, well, we can try it, but A, you have to listen to my instructions, and B, not do anything else, because otherwise we won't know if it's working. And with that significant injury, we don't want to fool around. And so she had been referred to a neurosurgeon, and they were going to do surgery on it. So being that our healthcare system is backlogged, she had a 1.5 year wait for surgical intervention. So over that 1.5 year, we worked, and she felt better, and she was able to do more things. And then the doctor called and said, "Okay, your surgical date is here, and we need you to go for pre-op scans, and then we know what where we need to go." And so she went for her scans, and she got a call back from the doctor, and the doctor said, "So you're no longer a candidate for the surgery. I don't know what you did, but it's the compression has reduced, so it's not impinging that nerve that we would do surgery." So she said, "Oh, okay." And he said, "Well, whatever you're doing, keep doing it." And she said, "Do you want to know what I'm doing?" He said, "No." So we have that data wasn't collected, of course, because we were just doing, there was really limited options for her. And that was, really profound for her, and changed that situation. Now there's others that were not so, acute like that people will share. It's changed how they move. People that tell me that they can get on the floor with their grandchildren and play, and people that, other activities that they do, they don't suffer the consequences as much. People that have issues from professions, so, somebody that uses one arm repetitively or sits in a chair for a long period of time, or all those kinds of things, those things are changing. Athletes that have injury or potential injury, some of my athletes will come right away and say, "Okay, there's a little niggly thing that's starting up." And it's like, "Okay, let's nip it in the bud." And they do, and they know now how to listen to their body, and they know how to employ what they need, as do all of the people that have been coming consistently, because they know it works for them, and they know what works for them, and they don't need me to tell them so much anymore, although they like coming because they learn more. So it's been a really exciting experience, and life-changing, really.
That's awesome. And so, do you, with your own explorations, are you offering any type of, teacher training workshops in this, or are you predominantly working with clients, exploring with them, and playing as you go?
Yeah, no, we have a teacher training, 200-hour yoga teacher training and 300-hour yoga teacher training. We've done one round since COVID, but we didn't do during COVID because I wasn't a big fan of the online for myself. And so we're getting back to that. So all of this is taught in our yoga teacher trainings, as well as we have coming up the Integral Movement Systems series, and we have 4 modules of that. So we taught, the first one is the principles of motion. Then we go through the stretch, the strength, and the mind. And those right now are weekend courses. Yeah.
Where would I find you online if I did want to, experience this type of movement with you? Do you have anything online or any resources at all?
Yep. The integral movement classes are all online on Zoom. on a regular drop-in schedule. And then I'm working on looking at an online option for the integral trainings. The in-person studio ones are all day, and that just gets to be too long for an online learning. So I'm looking at creating an online experience that isn't so overwhelming in that time. I mean, it's really hard to be on a screen and learning for 8 hours a day. Shorter times, but a little bit of a longer course for an online option. So that's coming up.
Oh, great. Well, we'll definitely keep an ear out for it. And, as it happens, I'd love for you to let us know. For my own, I mean, I call what I do Pilates because we've got to call what we do something. But,
Right, yeah.
if I went out to dinner and someone asked me what I do for a job, I almost, excuse myself to go to the bathroom because I never know how to explain what I do. So, as a movement educator and a movement lover, any type of learning is so key, and learning from somebody else's life experience and somebody else's perspective really is what keeps us being able to give back to our community, which I guess is really what we're all doing this for, right? Is because we want to serve our community. So I'd love to hear about anything that you've got going on, but we'll definitely pop in the show notes all of your details for people to keep an eye on you. I did see on your website that you've got a pelvic floor workshop coming up, and what really struck me was that it talks about pain, scar tissue, and multi-dimensional movement within a pelvic floor workshop. Could you, just before we leave, could you talk a little bit about that? I just know that as Pilates professionals, people are often talking about the core or pelvic floor. It tends to be a buzz topic for the Pilates world. So could you just touch on that a little bit?
Sure. In class, in our regular classes, I mean, my students are now really comfortable in sharing their experiences and sharing the changes that they've noticed in their bodies and such. And so some had pelvic pain, pelvic floor pain, prolapse, that kind of thing. And so I started exploring, okay, how do we address this? What do we do? So we brought it into class a little bit. And then I had a woman one time, it was just when we were getting back in studio after the restrictions from COVID. And this one woman showed up for class. She was the only one. And so I always think, okay, there's purpose here. So and I treat it as a one-on-one usually. And so she had an upper spine strain that she got when she was skiing. And so she told me that when she came in, she said, don't worry, I'll just modify. And so I just cued everything based on what I saw in her movement and what she told me. So afterwards, she said, this strain is gone now. And could you do what you did for pelvic floor dysfunction? And I said, well, I guess so, because we had started sort of dabbling in that and exploring that. And she said, because I'm a doctor. And so I kind of, ooh, okay. And we have run out of resources. We don't have enough resources for all of, she saw women, she's a doctor of women's health. I don't have enough resources to send all these patients for pain relief and so on. And I said, well, sure, we can do that. And so we met after, and she talked about, her experience as a doctor and what she's looking for and the resources that she has. And then we went through some movement and, yes, and tweaked some other things. And then our program was born. And so we've had a lot of good feedback from it. But the omnidimensional aspect of it is that sometimes pelvic floor pain is not necessarily to do with the pelvic floor. And so a lot of times I'll look at the feet, what are happening at the feet. And Dr. Neil Galloway, who specializes in pelvic health, said the first thing he looks at when he has a new patient is their feet. And he can tell a lot about their pelvic health when he looks at their feet. And there's so much connectivity that you can see through from the feet up into the pelvis, and then, the diaphragm and certainly up from there. So you can start to see this, and then you can address those, what I call disconnects or inefficiencies in movements that affect the pelvic floor. So my experience was when I was young, I had really bad asthma. So I was always gasping and trying to grab air. So the upper part of my back was very, very tight from trying to take in breaths And as I thought about it, and as I worked with releasing that and changing how I worked with breath, it dawned on me that I was also constipated when I was a child. So that was from the restriction at the top of trying to pull this breath in, because not long after I started as a fitness teacher and trainer, my asthma was much more manageable and almost non-existent. So movement is a huge thing, but it's got to be movement that honors what's inside the body. So one thing that I'm aware of is when you draw navel to spine, and I know people still use this cue, so it's something to consider and to explore a little bit. When we draw the navel to the spine, it brings the spine into flexion, and then the pelvis goes into a posterior tilt. And so then if you notice what happens at the bottom of the pelvis when you do that, you get a sense of, okay, what's going on? How often do we draw navel to spine? A lot. I know we trained ourselves to do that all the time. And so it's something to consider that this might be causing some of the pelvic dysfunction that we see, the incontinence, the prolapse, the pain, all of those kinds of things. And, that's just what I notice in class. And by changing my cues for myself and then my students, that it made a huge difference for all of us in different ways, but a big difference.
It's so fascinating, isn't it? I had a client yesterday that I worked with for the second time, and the first time she came, she's a midwife by trade, and she came, and she specifically came because L4-5 are compressed and she's getting a lot of back pain. So, we started, just doing things to alleviate that on the first session. Well, the second session, I noticed that she got super high arches in her feet, and I asked, do you suffer from plantar fasciitis? Oh yeah, my feet kill when I get up in the morning. Okay, cool. Well, let's start. Let's start by releasing your feet and see how that feels in your back. And then we start talking about up the line. Oh, well, actually, 12 months ago, I had prolapse surgery. And when they stitched me up, my pelvic floor is so tight now. In my mind, I'm like, ding, 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 ding. And then I asked the question, so you tell me, did your back start hurting before or after the surgery? Oh, about 2 months after the surgery, my back started hurting. And then I also started getting this neck pain just on this side. And in the second session, I'm like, this is not a disc problem. Let's go back and let's start working from the feet. Let's see if we can release the feet, potentially help release the pelvic floor, potentially help release that neck issue that you've got going on. And then maybe this is all a part of what you are experiencing so that you don't end up with back surgery. I think we see it if we let ourselves see it and if we don't box ourselves in to what we initially learned, so maybe we've got to start with some sort of system. When we first start teaching, there's got to be some sort of foundation that we learn from, of course, but if we can really be open to, to being educated by the person that we're seeing in that moment in time, and even more so be open to realizing that what they're coming to us with isn't actually what they're coming to us with, because even their perception of what is wrong is not always, where maybe that's just symptomatic. Maybe that's not, that's just their body giving them feedback. That's just their body trying to cue them, but maybe they weren't listening to the whispers, and so now the body starts yelling, But oh yeah, there's so many things to explore in the body. I love this conversation. I love that on the other side of the world you'll see. I feel like you see what I see, and you've had the courage to explore it. I feel like as movement, professionals, it's one of the things that we should be able to do is explore and not just be stuck in this box of this is what the science says or this is what the evidence says. Or when I was at John Sharkey's workshop, one thing that always resonates with me is he said, as movement educators, science is slowly catching up to what you are already seeing in the body.
And, Katie, it's hard because when we started Integral, and that's why it's called Integral, we had to make its own entity because we had some really upset students that didn't want anything to change. And that's fine. So we just changed the name so it was clear where they were going and what they were doing. And we had to keep clear. We had to be clear of what props we were using in what class and so on. And so it's hard. It takes courage to say, okay, we're not doing the same old anymore just because it's always the way we've done it. And then somebody said to me, well, you're not very traditional with yoga. Well, I don't know, yoga, there's parigraha where it's non-attachment. I think that those before us, regardless of what modality or science even would want us to do, is take what they did and make it better. And nothing stays the same. I think we're supposed to evolve these things. And I think if you and I, connected in a year's time and talked, we would notice that there are some things that we've changed from now because we've learned. And so the discussion and the dialogue is so key when we come to these conversations with an open mind and a willingness to suspend what we know and listen to what other people's experiences are and knowledge is, and maybe explore that and maybe dabble with it in our own experiences. And that's how we learn, even if it's listening to somebody else's experience or expertise and saying, you know what, I've worked with it a little bit and it's just not for me. And maybe it's just not for me right now, whatever the case. And that's how we're going to learn. And I think that's how we're going to propel this to the end user, because I don't know about you, but it breaks my heart every time I have a client and they tell me how pain and restriction has interrupted what they enjoyed doing in their lives and spending time with loved ones. And it breaks my heart. And it's like, okay, that's okay. We're going to move and see what we can do with this. And there are some that are so committed and I give them all homework. They do their homework every day. And then we have dialogue, and they're not scared to say, Lisa, this doesn't work for me. This is painful for me. And I tell them, okay, you aren't the problem. The movement is the problem. We need to change the movement. If I don't know, I will find out as much as I can so that we can figure something else out for you. Hence why our connections are so, so important. When you asked me to come here, I went and I looked at, your reels and stuff on Instagram so that I had a sense of, okay, what's the collaboration here in the intention of coming together and having this discussion. And so I just feel really privileged to be here and talking with you and sharing with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I love this idea of always forever learning and learning from everybody that we meet in our life, in the studio. Every person who walks past us on the street, I feel like is a lesson in movement and observation in movement. And I agree. If we can serve our community to not only allow for them to find joy in movement, but empower them to be able to do whatever it is that they want to do, whether it's, just enjoy being with family. We're not necessarily empowering somebody to run a marathon. We're just giving somebody back a little bit of grace so that they can live their life more comfortably. And we're doing that ultimately just by giving them space, not even by teaching, but by giving them space, because I feel like everybody's so busy in the world that they're not giving themselves just that moment in time to listen to themselves, to allow for them to start to heal, or to start to release, or to start to let go, to then be able to get stronger in the first place. So thank you so much for being one of those people on the other side of the world.
Yes, yes, but it makes the world a little bit smaller when we can connect like this. So,
Mhm.
yeah, I pretended I was going to Australia today in the dead of winter here. So, it's making the world a little bit smaller with our conversations and things and doing our things in our own little spots, and then bringing it back together in these conversations with our with the results of it, and bringing that forward and getting more information from our clients and students, and a wonderful place to be. Just one more thing, what you said about, giving space for people to explore their movement. Joanne Avison says something that's really beautiful, in that we are creating the possibility for them to have an experience. And so it reminds me of where my place is in the room. I'm not holding anybody's space. I'm not conducting them as, what they should be doing, or how it should look, or how it should feel. And so then they have their own experience, and they know what they need.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love it.
Thank you. Yep.
Hey, before we go, I would love for you to share with our listeners, do you have a daily practice of anything, whether it's movement or meditation? Do you have a daily practice? And if so, what is it?
Yeah. So usually in the morning, I do a little bit of integral mind. So it's just letting my thoughts move, and then noticing what's useful, what's supportive, and then letting that guide me. And then I usually do I find center, which when I teach, it's engaging from the soles of the feet to the top of the head. And in all of that, there's an experience of center. And then I integrate, and this is what I recommend to my students too, is integrating little snippets of movement throughout the day. So I have things that I do with when I brush my teeth, for example. So finding center, and then maybe floating into a tree pose, or doing a little bit of hip extension, maybe with some rotation, going the other way in flexion. So just playing with those small, meaningful movements to create the structure in the day. And then I don't roll as much as I used to. I don't find I need it so much, but when I've overextended myself, then, I'll grab my ball, and I'll do a little bit of that. Yeah, so it changes all the time, and it's throughout the day more, rather than a full hour and then moving on and that's it. It's snippets throughout the day of different things. And from awareness of when I need. Where do I feel heaviness? Where do I feel like I'm sinking in my body? Okay, how can I expand? Well, if I expand from my heart, now my shoulders want to move a little bit. So maybe a little bit of internal, external rotation will emerge, and then off I go. And it might be when I'm doing something else, like brushing my teeth, or I used to have this routine when I'd open the pantry doors in my cupboards, because I would get that beautiful motion through my spine and shoulders. That for a time, that's what I needed, because that's the thing, you change the environment with movement, so eventually the movement that you're doing is going to change, it's going to shift. So the repetitive, constant, all the time the same thing, well, you're not going to go too far from that into that multi-dimensional, omnidirectional movement that is the fascia network. Yeah. So, yeah.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you so much for your insights, for your collaboration, and for your time. If our listeners want to find you, where's the best place to find you? Are you on social media or website? Where's your chosen platform?
Yeah, I'm on both Facebook and Instagram. I've got two. I've got Soul Fitness. I think it's SoulFit MB Studios is the Instagram handle there, and then we have Integral Movement also on Instagram and Facebook, and then there's me, Lisa Babuik. So 3 spots that you can find me, and if you have questions, message me there.
Awesome. We'll be sure to pop that all in the show notes for our listeners. Thanks again, Lisa. You're an absolute gem. World needs more of you.
Thank you, Katie. Oh my gosh. This has been wonderful. It was so lovely to meet you. Your students and your clients and are so lucky to have you. So thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. You're welcome.
Now, before I finish up today, I just want to remind you, if you have enjoyed this episode, I would love it if you like and share it with your Pilates professional and movement loving friends so that we can get the word out there and really create a community right here in this hub. Be sure to check out my website, thepilatesprofessional.com.au, and have a look if you can find any workshops, which I'm sure you can, that you may be needing right now. Remember, I also do a 6-month reformer teacher training mentor program. I call it a mentor program because I literally personally mentor each student through their own program until they are ready to teach reformer. It's what I specialize in. And I think that this is one of the biggest missing links in our industry right now, is that we have these wonderful diploma level training workshops that people can do to become very comprehensively trained in Pilates. But when it comes to reformer, it's so wishy-washy out there that you could become an instructor online with no personal access to a mentor ever, or you could become a reformer instructor as a stepping stone to diploma level training. So where I come into it is I just do reformer teacher training that is recognised and recommended by the Pilates Association of Australia, which means that my students then become members of PAA. It's super important for our industry and it's what our students deserve. So if you know somebody who is looking to become a reformer teacher, then this is where you want to send them, the pilatesprofessional.com.au. They can reach out to me. I can have a call with them and see if I have a program that is coming up that is suitable for them. And or I also do a host of online workshops for you to expand your repertoire and your understanding specifically of the Pilates work. Thank you so much for joining me. I look forward to you listening to the next episode next week. I'm Katie Crane, the Pilates Professional.